Hello, everybody. We are joined by Sarah Gold, who is a litigator at Legal Impact for Chickens. She attended UC Berkeley Law School, where she served as the president of the Animal Law Society and intern for Mercy for Animals. Today's questions will be about the work LIC does, animal law in the US, and also Sarah's own journey to becoming a litigator for animals. So, to start us off, could you briefly tell us what LIC does?
Sure. LIC seeks to bring innovative lawsuits to hold companies liable for cruelty to animals. And so we use strategic litigation, whereby we sue companies in civil court. So we sue them civilly for breaking criminal laws. And we focus on farmed animals and mainly on chickens, just because they comprise the largest number of beings who are, being tortured and killed every single day in factory farms. And so that's basically our goal, is to end the suffering of animals and to hold these companies liable.
Yeah, so the other big players in the litigation space are PETA, Animal Defense Fund, and I'm sure like several other animal law clinics as well. So what's new about LIC's approach?
So what's new about LIC's approach is just the fact that we are focused exclusively on farmed animals. We don't bring any sort of lawsuits about household pets like cats or dogs. And we also take an effective altruism approach, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that philosophy, but it's sort of, how can you benefit the greatest number of beings? And so that is why, like I mentioned before, we're focused on chickens and factory farming in general, just because that is the most harm to the most number of sentient beings in the world. And we're seeking to curtail that and to hold these companies liable.
Yeah, so could you walk us through what the different types of cases that you file at LIC?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit. What did you say?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I just asked, what are the different types of cases that you file at LIC?
Absolutely. So like I said, when we're deciding what kind of case to bring, we always, the way that we approach litigation is we think about, when we're filing this lawsuit, how many animals are impacted? How many animals can we help by filing this lawsuit? And so to date, we've filed one lawsuit, which was against Costco. I'm not sure if you've read a little bit about it. I can go into a little bit of detail. It was a shareholder derivative case where we were basically we were actually suing on behalf of Costco. So it's not like we were, going against Costco. We represented the shareholders, and we just wanted to make sure to basically hold the board liable for the cruelty that was going on to these animals, in that they were sort of breaking state law by not giving the birds access to food or water. And so we filed the lawsuit on behalf of the shareholders, so to hold like the board of directors liable.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is there any progress on the Costco lawsuit? So how is the timeline like for the case?
Yeah, so usually the way things work in litigation is, you file the complaint and then you have sort of briefing done. There's usually a motion to dismiss. And so we had a hearing a few weeks ago with the judge, and Aline did the oral argument. She did a fantastic job. Unfortunately, the judge decided to dismiss the case, which is, it's fairly common in these animal law cases. But what's important is that, this sort of like, this opens the pathway to future litigation of this type. And so even though he dismissed like LIC, we still have options. We're working with our plaintiffs to decide what to do next. We could appeal, we could make a demand on the board, which is something, the judge said the door is still open for. And so there are definitely, the door's not closed. And this sort of just, I think one benefit of litigation that, the judge even is that it's not necessarily about the case at hand, to this type of cruelty. They can't just get away with it. There are organizations out there like LIC, like the other animal organizations that you mentioned, that seek to hold these companies liable. And like, we're not going to stop until animals are treated better. Absolutely.
And so this is a case where you're taking the plaintiff's side, right? So Are there also cases where you would take the defendant's side? So like cases where you're on the side of the quote unquote felons who are charged for like rescuing farmed animals, or undercover investigators who are sued as a result of breaking into farms?
That's a great question. And there's been a lot of that recently in the news. I'm not sure if you're familiar with DXE and the type of work that they do. But as of now, we're not doing that type of work. Like I said, we're focused on effective altruism principles, and so we're focused on helping the greatest number of chickens or animals, farmed animals out there. And so we're like a small litigation boutique, sort of, you could say. And so our focus is really just on bringing these strategic litigation to help these farmed animal types of cases. And so that's not really the type of work that we do. I'm not going to like foreclose that and say that we'll never be open to that area, but as of now, what we're focused on is really that sort of strategic litigation and bringing impact litigation is really what it's called. And there are many benefits to doing that, and so that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, so I want to now move on to more specific questions about farm animal law. So my first question is, how do you collect evidence when there are ag-gag laws in states like Alabama, Arkansas, Missouri that prevent undercover investigations from happening?
That's a great question. I think thus far, when what we've done so far is, North Carolina just got rid of their ag-gag law, and so that's been great. And in terms of those other states, I'd say that's a real barrier to litigation. I think that animal rights groups are, protesting those laws in court right now. But as of what to do, it's difficult because you can't use that undercover footage when it's illegal. And so you have to look for other strategic ways, whether it's just, news stories that come out or things the company's publicly stating. But a lot of the sources for lawsuits in animal rights, you're correct, do arise from these undercover investigations. And so that's definitely something that and working toward eliminating.
Yeah, and how do you go about picking what state to sue in? So for the Costco case, it was the state of Washington, even though the farm was in a different state, right? So is there like anything that you take into consideration? Is it where the company's incorporated, or what state you're most likely to win in?
Absolutely. There are a number of different factors that we consider. So first of all, you have to consider what court obviously has, jurisdiction over you, where you're going to have standing, all these sort of like legal concepts and notions. And once you narrow it down to where a court will have jurisdiction and in the particular venue, you have to make sure that all those sort of aspects are met. And then it comes down to exactly what you mentioned, where we think we'll have the likelihood of winning. Whether, you don't want to bring a case in a court where let's say the company you're suing is that's all the people in that town care about, and the judge will sort of have a bias. You want to think about the types of judges that you might get, and whether based on their past history of cases, they've been like more lenient towards animal rights groups or not. And so it takes a number of various considerations. Sometimes we don't have a choice, right? And it's just where the cruelty occurred. But other times we do have sort of more options, and it's about thinking strategically and balancing the different needs of the case at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So my next question is about animal laws in general in the US. So I found this map on the website of Animal Defense Fund, and they showed different states' rankings of how animal welfare friendly their laws were. And I saw a huge variation. So we saw California and surprisingly Texas having, pro-animal laws. And then in the middle, you had like Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, like the worst offenders, we've got like Iowa, Wyoming. So what explains this like variation in anti-cruelty laws?
Absolutely. I just say it has to do a lot with the activities that are conducted within that state. And so when you're in more of a southern state and more of these, anti-animal welfare states, factory farms are usually located there. A lot of people in that state are employed by these farms, and that's their source of livelihood. And so they feel very strongly and very connected to sort of protecting these corporations. In terms of what else explains it, I'd say I think that makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of California, it's also about the elected officials, right, and what types of laws you're able to get on the books and what voters will vote for. Like in California, we have different propositions, and that sort of helped out a lot with cage-free eggs, for example. Whereas in other states, that's a ballot. Other states, maybe don't have ballot measures like that, or they wouldn't pass if they did. And so it's just a lot about the political composition of the parties in the state.
Yeah, and it might also have to do with like lobbying that some of these farms do, right? So they might lobby legislatures and some cases both parties, and that would make it impossible to get like laws in some of these states. And so would you think that perhaps trying to make it more difficult for states to actually open slaughterhouses is a good way to make sure that the laws don't turn the other way and against animal welfare?
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely support that. I think that, the fewer slaughterhouses we have, the better. So, as you know, like in the US, slaughterhouses are sort of immune from a lot of the laws on the books. Like a lot of times nuisance laws don't necessarily apply, as well as, Clean Water and Air Acts. There are all these sorts of limits. And even with the animal cruelty laws in general, there are usually exemptions for, common husbandry practices, or that sort of exempt these factory farms from liability. And so I think the fewer sort of institutions that we have, the better. Absolutely. I think that's a very strategic avenue. It's not one that LIC is focused on pursuing. Like I said, we're focused on just, advocating for the animals themselves currently. But I think that like as a sort of secondary type of, or a different type of work, I think that all sorts of actions within the animal rights movement are important. And so it would be great to have people sort of lobbying for that effect as well.
Yeah. And given that different states have different laws, how does legal precedent work? So if there is like one state with lacks laws, and there's another state that enforces laws, how does it kind of work, and do resources get wasted having to litigate the same case again and again?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that it works in the US is that, let's say we're suing in federal court, then it's the case. This is just sort of like how precedent works, right? And so you look to the highest court, which has binding authority. So if you're suing in federal court, obviously, the Supreme Court has the last word. If there's no Supreme Court case on the matter, then you look lower, which is the appellate courts. If the appellate courts haven't decided anything, then there really isn't any binding authority within the jurisdiction. But trial courts will sort of, look to other district courts within the jurisdiction to determine what's persuasive evidence, not evidence, but, persuasive authority, but nothing would be binding. And then, like you said, a lot of the cases that we do bring in animal law are based on state laws. And so the way that it works within the states are a little bit different, because other state law and state cases, they're not applicable because it's a completely different jurisdiction, right? And so you look to the highest court within the state, which is usually, the state Supreme Court. Obviously, if the Supreme Court has, the general US Supreme Court has something to say, that's always binding, but it would only be interpreting state law anyway. So really, it's the state Supreme Court that has that sort of binding authority. It's usually, I wouldn't say, usually for the types of cases we bring, you can look to the state Supreme Court for like a rule to cite or something, but it's never going to be like super applicable to the facts at hand. And so then at the next step, you would sort of look to the Court of Appeals, or, that appellate kind of the same as within the federal court, but within the state jurisdiction, you look to that appellate level. And then after that, you just look to general trial courts within the state itself, which, like I mentioned before, with federal, it's not going to be binding authority, so it wouldn't really be, but it would still be precedent in the sense of like that's something that lawyers as well as judges can point to and say, hey, look, either I or a fellow judge within this state have, decided a case this way, and so we're going to follow that. Often when it's a case of first impression, judges are hesitant to sort of, make a new ruling if it's never been done before. So that's why, like you mentioned, precedent is super important, even at the trial level where it's not like binding authority, it can be extremely persuasive. And so, like I said, that's another reason why why, it's important to think about what state you're going to bring the lawsuit in, because you have to look at the authority that's on the books. You have to look at the persuasive authority as well and see what judges are likely to rule, and, whether it's a case that has been brought before or something like that.
Yeah. So I'm from India, and so I don't really know how it works in the US, but how are civil cases decided? Is there a jury, or is it just what judges decide at the end?
Yeah, it depends on the district, but usually I'd say, at least in my experience, it's just been a judge. Yeah, it's usually a bench trial. The statute under which you're suing will usually, mention it explicitly.
Yeah. So and how are like judges in general in like smaller courts? And the reason I ask this is because in another podcast episode that I think Aline did, she brought up this time where a judge had to recuse themselves from a case. So I'd imagine that there are like many instances where judges are biased, or it's very easy for the other side to confuse the judge by, stating a bunch of exemptions that shouldn't actually apply. So how does it really work
Totally.
for these smaller courts?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult. I think, judges, they have a code of ethics that they have to abide by. And so if they do have any sort of like ways in which they would be prejudiced potentially, or certainly, they do have to disclose that before they continue with the trial, or, with the motion, and before they rule, basically, before they even hear the arguments. The judge will have to sort of say any sort of prejudice they may have. I wouldn't say it happens like super often that a judge recuses themselves, but with these smaller types of courts in these states, like, yeah, if it's a local company, like maybe they have a relative that's employed by that factory or something like that, in which case, like, yeah, they'd probably have to recuse themselves. And so the way that works is then, the case would basically, go back to a different judge's docket, and we would appear before that different judge instead. But yeah, it's an interesting point, because I think it is more likely that it is to happen in these smaller courts and in these like smaller jurisdictions, where, you're trying to hold a company liable that might be the main source of income for people in that town. So it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. So how does it work? So if you are suing a company in like a state that has regulations, that has laws that are favorable for animal welfare, but the farms are located in a different state, does the ruling still affect farms in other places?
So I think this goes back to whether a court has like jurisdiction to hear the matters. So sometimes like a company will have operations is within one state that might provide, plaintiffs with an avenue to sue there within that. And in the state that has those criminal laws on the books, right? And so like it would be hard to hold a company liable in a different state for like in which there are no sort of similar laws like that. But it's an interesting question, and that's why I think that's more of a jurisdictional question.
Yeah. One of the things that shocked me is that a lot of prosecutors don't prosecute these cases, even in states that do have these laws in the first place. What do you think could explain that? Is it like heavy lobbying, or is it just them not prioritizing these cases?
Absolutely. So in the US, we have what's called prosecutorial discretion, which sort of, it gives prosecutors the bandwidth and sort of the ability to decide what cases they're going to prosecute, decide which cases they deem are the animal abusers, animal welfare, especially farmed animal welfare, is not at the top of that list. I'd say they focus on definitely, crimes relating to humans, and it's just something that they don't deem as important, unfortunately. And so it is within their discretion to decide not to prosecute. And so that's usually why especially for farm animals, which is really unfortunate. But that's sort of why here at LIC we aim to use strategic civil litigation to hold companies liable for breaking those same criminal laws. And it's interesting. Sometimes the statute itself will give you the ability to, sue a company civilly for breaking a criminal law, or we can do it like a shareholder derivative case. There are all these sort of possible, but yeah, we're always just considering when bringing a case, but if like the most number of chickens or farmed animals that it will benefit, and that's how we usually go about deciding what case to bring.
Yeah, so if there's a way to actually get prosecutors to prosecute, are there any benefits of these cases becoming criminal cases as opposed to civil suits?
Sorry, you broke up again.
Oh, okay.
What did you
Can you
say?
hear me now? Could you hear me now?
I think so.
Okay, yeah. So my question is, if we can somehow manage to get more prosecutors to do their job and actually prosecute these cases, are there benefits of them being criminal cases as opposed to civil suits, or is that broadly like the same?
Absolutely. I think there would be tremendous benefits. Like I said, I think it would be another example of sort of precedent that's out there. Oftentimes the repercussions or consequences of violating a criminal law are much more extreme than simply violating a civil law. You could be looking at jail time as opposed to simply a fine or an injunction to stop something. It could hold more serious repercussions. And so I think that there are absolutely benefits to enforcing the criminal laws, if possible.
Yeah. I want to now talk about the defendants and what usually is their argument. So is it like them saying that they didn't know about the law, or like them finding some exemption? How does it work? Does it differ from case to case?
It definitely differs from case to case, but I would say it's never that they don't know about the law. It's just that they kind of argue that the law is either wholly inapplicable to their case, or that there is an exemption, or that a lot of times what it is that they'll say the facts of this specific case do not rise to the level to be covered by the law. And so they'll allege that, what occurred was not cruelty, or it was not widespread enough to rise to the level of falling within the definition of animal cruelty under the statute. And they have a lot of different defenses. I'd say it definitely varies from case to case. It depends what kind of claim we're bringing to begin with. But yeah, they definitely do not shy away from a number of defenses.
Yeah. And on these companies, again, do they gain any legal advantage through doing contract farming, where they outsource the farming to like individuals as opposed to having it directly under them?
Yeah, I think it just provides sort of another hurdle that we sort of have to get through in order to hold them liable. A lot of times we're able to just argue that the companies that they outsource the sort of labor to are their agents, and so that the parent company should sort of still be held liable. But oftentimes it's a little bit more like discontinuous, and so it's harder to sort of allege that sort of relationship. But I definitely think that, yeah, that's beneficial for them to not have it necessarily under their name, to sort of, but it depends, right? Sort of look to how much control they have over their subsidiary. Like there are all these number of factors that a court would consider, but it's definitely something that makes it not as simple for us as saying, hey, you personally are doing this cruelty, and therefore, it's just an extra step kind of that we have to go through.
Yeah, I want to come back to these anti-cruelty laws themselves for a second. So a lot of these anti-cruelty laws are defined broadly, right? Where they're like, do not neglect, do not abandon. And one of the advantages of this is obviously that you can bring more cases forward, and you can argue that the same would apply to cages or to culling. But the disadvantage in being more broad is that it's harder to say that this is a clear violation of the law, and it can also make it easier for them to skirt the definition. What is your take on this?
Yes.
Do you think that the law should be more broadly defined or more specific?
I think that's a great question. I think that, I mean, the problem with the law, like we mentioned before, are these all sorts of these exemptions. But what I found from, my personal practice isn't necessarily an issue with the law themselves. It's the way that the law is being interpreted, or the way that the facts are being interpreted. And so oftentimes a judge and the other side will just sort of say that the facts of cruelty that we're alleging do not rise to the level of what is anticipated by the statute. And so there is a sort of a sense of statutory interpretation involved in a lot of these cases. And I think, yes, statutes can definitely be made more clear. We can have, I would be a big fan of sort of getting more statutes on the books that are just what is a clear violation of the law, and sort of, get rid of these exemptions. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And so what we have to do right now is just think of creative ways to sort of, argue why they are violating the law. And oftentimes it does seem super clear, and it's just people aren't willing to sort of get rid of factory farming, and yeah, it just depends on the facts at hand, and how much knowledge management have about it, how widespread the harm was. There are all sorts of different factors at play. And I think, but yeah, I would be a fan of sort of, if possible, in an ideal world, definitely rewriting some of these statutes would be beneficial.
Yeah. My other question about these laws is on ag-gag laws, right? So recently, I think North Carolina got rid of them. But are there cases where you would challenge the constitutionality?
Right.
Yeah, am I clear now?
Sorry, you said challenge the constitutionality.
Yeah, challenge the constitutionality of ag-gag laws by saying that it wouldn't by referencing First Amendment scrutiny. So, are there cases that you could also do like that to get rid of ag-gag laws, as opposed to waiting for legislation that would eventually remove them?
Really involved in these types of cases, that ALDF and other in Arkansas sort of referencing the North Carolina law and trying to sort of get the judge to rule that these ag-gag laws were unconstitutional for the reasons you said, and for other reasons. Unfortunately, the judge did not rule in their favor, but it's definitely an ongoing effort, and it's something that I think they're going to continue trying to fight in Arkansas and in other states if possible. But yeah, a lot of times it's hard to get a ruling of unconstitutionality like that. But it can happen. It's possible. It's not something that I personally am involved in, but I absolutely appreciate the effort of others.
Yeah, and now on the outcome of the lawsuits themselves. So what happens if you do win a lawsuit? So who usually decides the course of action following that to prevent the violation from happening again?
Sorry, what was the question? Who decides what?
So let's say that you win the Costco lawsuit, right? So who gets to decide what Costco has to do and what they have to do as a result?
So I'm so sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. Who are you asking? Who decides like what actions they have to take?
Yeah, like who decides the actions and what are these actions likely to be?
Hello?
Can you hear me? Hello.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So yeah, that would basically be the judge in the ruling of the case. And so oftentimes it would be, when you put forth a complaint, you will sort of have this prayer for relief where, it says exactly what you're asking for, whether that's injunctive relief, monetary relief, or some other sort of relief. And, if we would win a case, the judge would usually decide, based on what we've been asking for and based on his interpretation or her interpretation of the law, what the just outcome would be. So yeah, it's up to the judge.
Okay. And what happens if you lose a lawsuit? So do companies settle these lawsuits usually?
That's a great question as well. There are usually pretty much negotiations, depending on the company, depending on who's filing the case, how likely they think they are to win, and regardless of even if they think they're going to win, the amount of resource or bad press that it would take to sort of litigate these cases is often a motivation for companies to want to settle. For us, we only really look to settle if chickens are getting helped, if the farm animals that we are suing on behalf of are getting helped. So a lot of times companies, may offer in settlement negotiations things that we don't deem appropriate. And so, but yeah, it's litigation.
Yeah. And could you quantify how much it might cost for a company to litigate, just so that we might have an idea about why they might want to settle instead? Like, how much do these lawsuits usually cost for companies?
That's very hard to say. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's pretty hard to say, but it could range, from anywhere, not so much to hundreds of thousands. It depends how far you get into the litigation. It depends. Oftentimes, the companies aren't just going to use their in-house counsel. They're usually kind of outsource the work or hire another firm to represent them, and so that can be kind of expensive as well. And so it's not necessarily the money might be a factor, but I think a lot of it could also just be fear of bad press, a lot of different motivations for wanting to settle. And so, yeah, it's definitely hard to quantify though.
Yeah, so all of this was really insightful stuff on animal law in the US and also the work that LIC does. So I wanted to now move on to some questions about you. So what got you started working in animal welfare?
Yeah. I always wanted to become a vegetarian. I grew up with a dog, and I didn't really see the difference between him and a cow. But it was hard because my parents sort of didn't want me to progress down that route. But one day I decided I'm done. And so as a teen, I just became a vegetarian, and I've always been passionate about animals. And one summer, what really sort of solidified my interest in this area is I spent a summer interning as a shelter intern at Farm Sanctuary. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's an organization that rescues abused and malnourished animals and sort of provides them with a home where they can live the remainder of their lives in peace. And so living on that farm was really life-changing. I learned a couple things. I learned a lot about what goes on in the dairy industry as well. I learned that I'm not necessarily cut out for tough farm work, but that I am passionate about using what skills I do have to advocate for animals. And so law school seemed like the most viable path for me. And I went to law school with the full intent to become an animal rights lawyer. And so that's why I'm here today. But my path wasn't as linear as some others. I did during law school, I kept my connections with the animal rights movement, and I interned at various different animal law organizations, as you briefly mentioned before. And then right after law school, I worked at sort of a big law firm called Wilmer Hale, where I gained really invaluable experience. And I sort of using the skills that I developed there to really advocate for farmed animals and be the best advocate that I can be. And so that's a little background on me.
Yeah, and were there any personal challenges that you faced along the journey or any mistakes you might have made?
That's a good question as well. Yeah, I'd say some challenges every day are just knowing that the likelihood of success is low, and yet recognizing that I play such an important role in these animals' lives. And so it is worth continuing despite the adversity, despite the hardship. It can be difficult to sort of, watch these videos of constant animal neglect and abuse. It's not something that I enjoy doing. But I do, for the most part, really, really, I mean, overall, I love my job. That is just one aspect of it in which, it can be difficult and it can be hard. It can be emotionally taxing. But I feel so grateful that I'm in this position and that every day I'm able to, help design these lawsuits and be the best advocate that I can be for animals.
Yeah, so what does a day in the life look like for you?
Yeah, I'd say a day in my life is really interesting. I do have 3 dogs, and so a lot of it is taking them out, cuddling with them while I work. Luckily, my job is remote. And so I'm super grateful for the ability to be able to do that. I'd say when I'm not working on designing, new lawsuits or working on existing lawsuits, LIC is a pretty new nonprofit. So it's more of like a startup role that I have myself in sometimes, whether it's, helping out with the finances or budgeting or advertisements and things like that. I often work on like press releases for cases. And so my job is mainly to be a litigator, but it's also to sort of help out in these other aspects to help LIC grow and to become the best organization that we can be. And that's one of the things I love the most about my job, is that I'm not tied into, here's what you're going to be doing for this hour. It's what is the best use of your time, and how can you sort of divide your day up in ways that will bring the most benefit to animals. And that's sort of how I go about my day. And I'm really grateful. Yeah.
What advice do you have for people who are considering wanting to be an animal lawyer?
I would say stick to your passion, know what it is intuitively that made you decide that this was the right pathway. It's not going to be easy. If you decide to go to law school, you will likely not be surrounded by others who are interested in this field. You will be tempted to go in other directions. It may be hard to find a job. There are all sorts of adversity that I can talk about ways in becoming an animal lawyer. But the most important thing to remember is that animals need you. Animals need brilliant people like you who are kind to fellow humans and toward animals and who want to help. And that is the most important thing. And so sort of just remembering that whenever you get down on yourself and doubting yourself, and just going through law school and just remembering that you can do it, and animals need you and they're so grateful to you.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave us with? Anything we haven't covered so far?
I think we've covered a fair amount. I've really enjoyed this interview. I would just say, like I said, don't get discouraged. A lot of people within the animal law movement are so kind, and we're here to talk. Whether it's you, whether it's somebody else in the audience. My email is open. You are free to share that widely. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, which is sort of to help these animals, to help these farmed animals specifically. And so I just want to make sure that I'm doing the best job that I can. And that includes, educating and encouraging others to do their part as well.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being able to make it today's interview, Sarah. I know I kept you a bit over time, but let me just say that it was a genuine honor getting to talk, and your work is admirable and will go a long way in alleviating the needless suffering of animals in the world. And thank you, and I hope to catch up sometime again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.